You're listening to The Dead Prussian, a podcast about war and warfare.
We've talked a bit about strategy and generals and war plans and military theory and a whole heap of big hand, small map stuff on the show so far. Today, we're going to talk about something a little bit closer to the business end. More warfare than war. G'day listeners and welcome to the Dead Prussian podcast. It's your humblest host, the humblest of hosts, Mick here, and I have got in a guest today to talk to me more about what happens at the soldier's end rather than the politician or general's end. You've noticed we've had a fair bit on strategy in the past few weeks, even some deep history, and now we're going down a completely different line, but a line I think that Big Carl himself would have been quite happy with. My guest today is Brett Friedman. He grew up in Cleveland, Ohio, and entered the Marine Corps after graduating high school in 2000. He attended the Ohio State University and gained a BA in history, as well as the Naval War College, where he gained an MA in National Security and Strategic Studies. He transitioned to the Marine Corps Reserve in 2016 as a captain. Now, most importantly, Brett is the author of a book that will be released in May, published by the Naval Institute Press this year, and its title, strangely enough for today's episode, is On Tactics. Brett, thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you, Mick. Been a long-time listener since episode 1, so I'm excited to be a guest and disappointed that I'll have one less episode to look forward to here.
Well, mate, I find that listening to yourself is a special kind of therapy, so feel free to download this one and listen to it anyway.
I'll think about it.
Now, you've written a book that kind of sounds a little bit like something Carl would call a book. Your title is a nod to him. And before we get into this book, though, before we get right down into the tactics of your theories, I'm keen to know a little bit more about you and how you found yourself writing this book on tactics.
Well, before I wrote anything about tactics, I was a practitioner, as you mentioned. I was an infantryman in the Marine Corps Reserve and then commissioned and became a field artillery officer on active duty in the Marine Corps. I think you and Clausewitz would agree with me that field artillery officers are the smartest and best looking officers.
It's very true.
Anywhere you look. So after part of being a practitioner and I started studying strategy specifically, I found that strategy was a very organized field to study. You know, there were debates, of course, but there were a lot of agreed upon concepts, definitions. There was a framework for how to think about different aspects of strategy. But when you look at tactics, I didn't find any of that. It was very chaotic as a field of study. All we really have are lists of the principles of war, and every service has their own, and they're all different. So as looking at tactics from a kind of professional standpoint, I was dissatisfied with the state of tactics. So this book is kind of my attempt to organize it and fix that problem. When I look back at tactics after studying strategy, there was no on war for tactics. So I decided to attempt to write one. And fortunately, the Naval Institute decided to take a chance and publish it.
It's quite good the Naval Institute decided to take a chance on you. I'm yet to get a publisher to take a chance on me, but then I haven't written them anything or sent them anything. I've just text them every now to harass them.
That's kind of the key.
Now you've already published or edited a work before as well, haven't you? Can you tell listeners a little bit about that?
Yeah. So in 2015, I edited a book on the papers of Pete Ellis. Pete Ellis was a lieutenant colonel in the Marine Corps in the early part of the 20th century, and he wrote the bulk of the plans for how the Marine Corps was going to fight in the Pacific if there was a war. Now, this is in
rather prescient.
Early 1920s. He didn't know there was going to be a war, but he predicted there would be. So I edited his papers as part of the 21st Century Foundation series, edited by B.J. Armstrong. And that book has been out since 2015. And when I was done editing that, that's when I turned and started working on tactics. I thought I'd try to put my own stuff out there.
It sounds like we can actually expect more from you in future, which is good. Now, your book preface, that's right, listeners, I got an advanced copy of the book, and for any guests that get invited on the show, feel free to send me a preface of your book so I know what I'm talking about, although I may disprove that theory in the next few lines. Now, your preface mentions the relationship between theory and tactics before discussing the tactician's tasks. Now, what can you tell us about the relationship between tactics and theory? And, is this where strategy fits in?
Well, in the book, I take Clausewitz's definition of theory rather than supply my own. I wasn't going to retread his arguments. I took his on and tried to fit under his framework. So I view theory as a guide for the study of war, just like Clausewitz did. And he says you can learn from experience and history, but theory is what's going to help you do that, help you take it on and understand it. It's no different for the tactician. The tactician can learn from experience, training, history, and doctrine. But in my opinion, you need some kind of theoretical framework in order to understand all those things. The first step in building a house is a frame. And after you build the frame, you plug everything else into it. That's how I view theory. The bulk of the house is going to be other things like experience and history and training, but the framework needs to be there, preferably first. And for strategy and tactics, that's what theory does for us.
Well, you definitely must be a listener of the show because, as you know, anyone who gives a head nod to Big Carl receives a less acerbic version of my wit throughout the rest of the interview, so that's well played. Now, the first part of the book, as I mentioned before, goes into tactical tenets. Everyone needs tenets to get anything done in life, and I'm particularly fond of the firepower tenet myself, and I imagine you are as well. Can you tell the listeners a little bit about why each of these tenets is important?
So first, I'll describe kind of how I came up with all of them. When I first started researching the book, I found all the lists of the principles of war that I could find from every military that had one publicly available. I pulled all those together and came up with a giant list based on, ranked them all from how many times they appeared in lists of the principles of war. And I knocked a few off the bottom that only appeared once, and I had this giant list of recommendations for what the tactician should think about. Once I had that, I went about organizing them, and the tenets is the first thing I came up with. And the tenets, similar to the principles of war, is it's what's in the tactician's toolbox. It's things that the tactician can use to affect the enemy, or vice versa. You specifically mentioned firepower, and it's one of the main ones that a tactician can use to affect his enemy. Some of the others are mass and maneuver. They're very familiar to people who've been studying war for any length of time. So I put those all together because they operate on similar terms from the tactician's point of view. I also took a very broad view of the principles of war. So specifically with firepower, that could mean anything from a catapult or a trebuchet to a bomb dropped from an F-35. That's the view of firepower in the book. And I did that so I could take a very wide lens and try to answer some questions about how tactics operate. I talk in the book about a specific ambush on the island of Sicily in the 4th century BC when Syracusan hoplites ambush Carthaginian army. And then I pivot right to talking about Taliban ambushes in Afghanistan today. And very different weapons, very different situations, but the ambush is pretty much the same, and it has been for centuries, and it's always a good tactic. So part of the reason I wrote the book and organized the tenets in this way was to answer why those types of tactics endure across centuries.
The enduring nature of tactics, one might say.
Yes. That's exactly what I was looking for.
Now, the tenets don't just sit there as an elephant in the room at the start of the book. They also link into some tactical concepts towards the end of the book. Can you tell us a little bit about the tactical concepts and the relationship between the concepts and the tenets?
So I viewed the tactical tenets that I came up with kind of as the tactician's toolbox. But there are things outside his toolbox that he still needs to be concerned with, and he needs to understand in order to use his tools effectively. So I organized those things into concepts. And those are things like the culminating point of victory, environment and terrain, things that the tactician needs to understand, but they're not necessarily under his control. And I go into depth on a few more on how offense and defense is one, how these things are kind of environmental constructs that affect the way he does things, and he needs to be concerned about them. And that was part of my effort to organize and categorize tactics rather than just have a bunch of random lists with varying principles of war on them spread around the world. You may have also noticed that some of the tactics or some of the principles of war, I kicked out of tactics entirely and put into an annex in the back called the principles of planning.
Yeah.
So that just came from like simplicity and flexibility, things like that, where you're more concerned in the planning phase with those things than you are in the actual fight.
Yep.
Those ended up in the appendix, and I could write a whole nother book on operational planning. And if this one sells enough, maybe the Naval Institute Press will be interested.
Well, it's up to you, listeners. If you want another book from Brett, make sure you buy this one. Now, I'm going to ask a question that I didn't send you through in the run sheet or prepare you for, which is good. I've done this to a couple of guests so far to various degrees of success. But it's related to the book, so that actually makes sense.
Well, this just goes to show the probability and chance inherent in tactics. I should have been ready for you to use my tactical tenet of surprise.
Yes, and there's a reason that I'm doing this, and it's because I'm passionate about it. Now, the appendices in the back of the book, can you just tell the listeners a little bit about those? You've mentioned the principles of planning one, but there's a few other appendices in the back.
So the appendices are really just things that I think are important for the tactician to understand that not necessarily fit into the theoretical framework I developed from the principles of war. So one is I wrote on the operational level of war and how it should interact with tactics and strategy. And then even the last chapter of the book addresses strategy completely, even though the book's about tactics. And I did that because I found that the other problem with the principles of war is that they're decontextualized. You know, tactics means nothing without strategy. So the last chapter of the book, I make that case. If strategy is the bridge between tactics and policy, the strategist has to understand tactics, and the tactician has to understand strategy. And without those connections, none of those words mean anything. So the appendices are kind of an attempt to expand the aperture of the tactician a little bit.
That's it kind of brings up the phrase where people say, and I know Brett Friedman mentioned it in his book Strategy, and I'm not sure if he wants me to call him Laurie, but I'm going to because he doesn't have my number. You know, the concept of someone being strategically minded or the concept of someone being tactically minded. What I found from this book is that it sort of puts that in a different sort of context. There's a place for those who think tactically and there's a place for those who think strategically, and they need to take into consideration each other's thinking to be able to work together. Now, who is the intended audience for the book, and why should they read it?
Well, I mentioned in the preface that I wrote the book that I wish someone had handed to me at my commissioning ceremony when I became a second lieutenant. And from that, I think that NCOs and company grade military officers are going to get the most out of this book. It was written specifically with them in mind. And it was written by one of them because I was still in the military at the time. So I kind of wrote the one, I wish I had when I was a young man embarking on becoming a commissioned officer. Beyond that, I really tried to include naval battles and air power, but I think you'll agree it does reflect my greater comfort with ground combat. So I think naval officers and air officers may find something to like about the book and may understand their ground counterparts better. But they shouldn't pass it by just for that. I think I'm not an academic, but I think that military historians and scholars may get something out of looking at what they do from a practitioner's perspective, and a practitioner's humble attempt to do what they do. I think they would get something out of it. And lastly, anyone interested in military history is not only going to be interested in what happened at specific battles, but why they happened. And I wrote the entire book is with a mind for why things happened on the battlefield the way they did, why things worked, why other things didn't work. And I think that takes it a step beyond the typical military history, work of military history, as I'm delving into why those things happen.
And I would just like to say that it's got some Thucydides in there, and as we know, the land power is the one that ends up winning that war, the Peloponnesian War. Therefore, I think it's safe to say that it's appropriate that it focuses on the land, because that's where people live, and we're not really concerned about the other two services. Just kidding to all those naval and air people that I tend to work with every now and then and talk to on the show. Please come on the show. I need you on the show. Much like your book, I wish someone had have handed me this podcast back when I was a younger lad, simply because then I wouldn't have to be the one up at 2 a.m. interviewing you today. Now, Brett, my final question is one I ask for all guests. It relates to our mission here on the show, and that is to define war in as many ways as possible. Clausitz's theoretical standpoint, a way of studying war, not necessarily the answers to war. So suck it, Jomanians. I ask every guest on the show to finish the sentence war is. So, can you finish for me the sentence war is?
War is a tragedy. And I say that because I try to constantly remind myself. It's glamorous and fascinating and endlessly interesting. And speaking as a veteran of Iraq, personally rewarding in many ways. But it shreds the fabric of societies as much as it destroys people themselves. And in my view, if we're going to send people into that and inflict that violence on others, we should spare them no effort in studying war, understanding it, and avoiding it at all costs. Even as a civilian now, I'm a war game analyst for the Marine Corps and try to help guide procurement and doctrine. I try to remind myself that in some indirect way, I owe it to current and future Marines to do everything I can to understand warfare as a phenomenon and hopefully contribute in some small way to them coming home alive. And it's because war is so tragic that we have to understand it, we have to study it, and to fail to make the attempt is a tragedy too.
War is a tragedy. Now, not many guests know this, but if they say something that is bard-like, Shakespearean in terms and tones, then they get a pat on the back. So give yourself a pat on the back, Brett, because apart from Big Carl, the other favourite author is the bard himself, and I think you kind of fit into that area with your war is tragedy take. It is definitely something tragic, but something that needs to be studied, and it's important for all of us to study and understand these things we make, have our governments make decisions on. Now, for those who are after the book, you will be able to find it on Amazon, I'm told, and anywhere else that the Naval Institute Press pushes their work out. Jump on social media, jump on our social media, we'll post a link once it's released as well. It's coming out in May this year at all good book depositories. Let's call it that. There's actually a place called the Book Depository. I hope they don't sue me. All right, now, Brett, thank you very much for coming on the show. I know that it's an early Sunday morning there, but it's not as early as a Monday morning it is here.
Thanks for having me on, and good luck with the rest of your day.
Thanks very much. And one final point regarding Brett, listeners. For those of you who's used Twitter, I hear there's a couple of you. You can follow him on Twitter at @BA_Friedman. Thanks very much for all the reviews and support to the show. Listeners, the review episodes, whilst they're not as regular as the interviews, they are coming in and out, and we're recording them when we get the opportunity. But as I said, we're only recording reviews of things that we think will benefit the reader, viewer, listener. We're not necessarily just going to push out reviews to increase our download rate. And at every possible chance, I will try and get you an interview like this with an author rather than push out the 5 to 10 minute review episode. But until next time, listeners, grab a book and crack on.
Join the conversation with us on Twitter at Dead Prussian Pod, on Facebook at the Dead Prussian page, or on our website www.thedeadprussian.com. All show notes for this episode, as well as copyright information, can be found on the website. The Dead Prussian podcast is written, produced and hosted by Mick Cook. It is co-produced by Amanda Levito. The music used throughout is Caught in the Beat by Broke for Free and is used under a Creative Commons Attribution license. All opinions expressed by individuals on the podcast are those of the individual and not necessarily representative of any other organisation.